so strong. And now I realize, oh, I see the light when I look inside your eyes. I'm filled with devotion.
Welcome to Conversations in Color, a weekly series committed to open, honest conversation and exploring hard questions regarding race and racism in Western Wisconsin and beyond. Here is your host, Ed Hudgens.
Well, hello there and welcome to Conversations in Color, emanating from the beautiful Pablo Center here in downtown Eau Claire. We're in the Jam Theater. And just, oh, by the way, if you've never had the chance to see a show here or come here and check it out, when everything is open again, you should make it a point to do that. So glad that you are joining us for this week's episode. This show is all about helping us take a look and explore race and racial issues, racial justice issues in Western Wisconsin and beyond, and to kind of create a safe space for that. Toward that end, we have kind of three pillars to the ethos of this show and how we manage our conversations. First of all, we're committed to honesty. We're going to lean in hard on hard questions. We're not going to shy away from difficult conversations. Nothing gets accomplished if we do. So we're going to have honest conversation. We also care deeply about humility as we come into these conversations, because as flawed and limited human beings, none of us has really anything totally figured out. And so it behooves us to enter such conversations with humility. And then lastly, but certainly not least important, is humanity. We are going to uphold and celebrate the dignity and value of each human being, so nobody's going to get degraded or vilified in the course of these conversations. So before we go any further, it is upon me to introduce you to some of my friends who are going to spend the next hour and a half with us here. First off, our resident panelist. She is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. She is the president of Uniting Bridges. She wears about 10,000 hats in the area, and one of those hats is my partner in crime. This is my sister, Dr. CiC Ducksworth-Lawton. Thank you once again for joining us. We missed you last week.
I missed being here, but that was an amazing show. You know, you needed to have the guys here.
Yeah,
that was an amazing
that
show.
Time.
We're going to have one with all women, though.
Yep, and then I'll sit that one out. All right, and we've also got joining us tonight Representative Jody Emerson from the 91st District, Wisconsin State Assembly. She's been serving since 2018. She's a Democrat. Before she jumped into that world, she was very active when it came to human trafficking issues. Jody, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. We were going to have Representative Jesse James here as well, Republican state representative, but he let me know a little earlier today that he wasn't feeling well, and so he wasn't going to be able to make it. So unfortunately, unfortunately, we're stuck with Jody. That's not true. We're really excited about
Not the first time
Jody.
someone said that.
So, and then we have another partner in crime, my man Adam Akala, manning the computer over there. He works with CoLab here in town, and he also wears a lot of different hats, and he's a really important part of this whole operation here with Conversations in Color. Adam, what are you going to be doing over there tonight?
I'm going to be focusing on audience engagement like every week. So, to get your questions answered by our panelists here, make sure that if you're joining us on Paragon, you're dropping those questions in the chat. You can right-click my name if you don't want to drop them in the public forum and private message them to me. If you're listening to us on 99.9 FM Converge Radio, you can also call in your questions to 715-600-0267. Again, that's 715-600-0267. And we'll be sure that those questions are answered by our panelists tonight, as long as we've got time in this conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Adam. Do you have something else for us in this moment?
I do. I have our icebreaker for the evening. So we like to kick things off on a little bit of a lighter note. So tonight, the question is, have you ever been told that you look like someone famous? And if so, who was it? Ed, let's go to you first.
All right, so there are two that have come to mind, and I'm going to say both because I need to. The first one, because of the first one. The first one, my sister told me I looked like this big dude that was on ER or one of the hospital medical shows, this big tall dude with curly hair, and I'm sorry, I'm just much better looking than that guy. The second one was by a coworker. Back when right after I got my haircut, I used to have hair down to my shoulders, and I got my hair cut short, and she said that I looked like George Clooney. I'm going with that one.
I could see that.
Hey, sweet. Large George Clooney, but regardless.
He has gotten grayer now, so
That's
you know
right,
that
yeah.
maybe that's where it's at.
Yeah,
so.
that's totally where it's at.
I have had 3, and I don't believe any of them. In the 80s, people told me I looked like downtown Judy Brown, who was, she was a VJ on MTV.
right.
With your hair pulled back, I totally see it.
Yeah.
I didn't see it. And my students told me they thought I looked like Angela Rye, who is a political commentator. She's on CNN and several other places, but she's best known for being the person who laughed her head off when Omarosa got kicked out the White House. And that one I can kind of see, you know. But the last one my husband said, and I love him, but I think he's blind or something. We got to check those glasses. He said I look like Rainbow, the woman who plays Rainbow on Blackish. And I didn't see it. Nah.
Do we ever really see it when it comes down to it? I'm just wondering. I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know. That's Diana Ross's daughter. I'm not seeing it.
Well, I did have a friend tell me one time that I looked like Kate Winslet, but I think where it was coming from is, especially in the winter, I get very, very pale. And this was during Titanic time, so I'm thinking she meant that the Kate Winslet that was, you know, almost frozen on the piece of wood floating in the ocean. So she was incredibly white. That's the only thing I can think of.
The color of your hair is very pretty. It might be the color.
Why, thank you, ma'am.
You put the color up, you know, you put the hair up and you see the cheekbones and everything.
There you go.
Maybe that.
There it is.
I can see that.
I'm laughing at the thought. I knew as soon as you started talking about Kate Winslet and Titanic, I knew exactly where you were going.
See, you see the complexion,
No,
don't
it
you?
ain't that. I just
Little
knew
blue,
that's where you were
little
going.
white.
Adam, how about you?
One time I had a Starbucks regional manager, I believe, tell me that I looked like Tom Cruise. I was like working on the bar and I'm like covered in milk and syrup and espresso and like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never heard that. And then on another separate occasion, someone told me the same thing. And I don't see it. Like I said, I think that they need to get their eyes checked, but.
See, I think you were flipping bottles like Tom Cruise was in Cocktail, if maybe that was it.
Could be, yeah.
I don't know, more
All
like the
right.
guy who plays Captain America. That's more like who
Chris
you look
Evans?
like.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Yeah. It's a handsome dude. All right. Well, thanks for the question, Adam. Thanks for thanks for the levity. We need more of that these days, as it is. And I'll tell you, as we get ready to dive into the topic tonight, I've been feeling heavy all afternoon about tonight's show, and it's not because I ate too much. It's because I'm really disappointed that Jesse James wasn't able to make it tonight. And I know Jesse, and I want him to feel well, and so I'm praying for him and hope he gets well quickly. But as much as that's there, I'm also disappointed that he won't be here, so we can't hear his viewpoints tonight about some of the things that we're going to talk about. Because to me, this issue of the relationship between politics and race is really, really, really important. These things intersect on so many different levels. And what I have personally observed is we've seen what really comes down to life and death issues when it comes to injustice, police brutality, things like that, be minimized to campaign slogans. And that sickens me, both for my brothers and sisters of color and for my son of color. That really bothers me. And it's an issue of seeing people's lives being minimized to partisan politics. And so for me tonight, I was really looking forward to diving into some of these things with Jesse and Jody. But even without Jesse here, we've got a lot to talk about. And despite what I said earlier, Jody's awesome. I'm really glad that she's here. So let's go ahead and dive in a little bit here.
I am going to say a little bit that I had an encounter with Jesse.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
I only know him through this one encounter. And as I've done before, I will not say the name of the miscreant here to protect the guilty.
Miscreant.
Because this is an elected miscreant who I was at a Republican event representing Uniting Bridges. And because I'm an independent, you know, so I'll do that every once in a while, as long as people aren't misbehaving. I'll show up at Democratic events too. Yeah. And there was an individual there, and I have to admit I started it because I had asked this person a question on WPR and they had bobbled it. So I came up and asked why, and this person got defensive and said a couple of things that I'm not sure they realized were racially offensive. How can a police officer tell you from a criminal black? That kind of stuff.
Oh, wow.
And Jesse James was there, and he did step in and he did support my point. He does not believe in police brutality. He doesn't believe in supporting it. And he made a comment that really does sit with where I feel, which is he wishes that the Milwaukee police would come up here and train with the police up here, because the police that we see in Eau Claire, Altoona, and Menominee are professionalized. And they're doing the Memphis method, and they're doing all of these things to prevent police brutality. The irony is that Minneapolis and Milwaukee are not doing these things. So we really did want to have him up here because both Jody and Jesse have these reputations for integrity and for putting the people first. And we wanted to have that discussion with him. So really sad that he's not here. But Jody's awesome. I've known Jody for a while.
Jody is enough for us.
Jody is enough.
That might be too much by the end of the night.
We'll be okay.
Okay, got it.
Now, if we start talking about Prince, then
No,
there's
we're
a
not
whole
talking
different
about
story.
Prince tonight. Stop bringing Prince into the thing here, okay?
I miss Prince.
So let's take a step back because we've had a couple of controversial, painful things that have happened in the last few weeks here. One has had to do with the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire here, and CiC, I would ask you to correct me if I'm wrong in how I'm recounting this. But some time ago, some of the football players on the UW Eau Claire team posted some things on Snapchat which were extremely racially offensive and hurtful. They were brought up within the judicial system in the university and were basically kind of let off to join the football team and such. So first of all, Salika, would you add any pertinent detail to that you think?
Well, there were complaints at the time that these events were not just racially offensive, but that they were a form of criminal harassment. The university chose not to press charges because we're an educational institution. But because of that, within our judicial system, our handbooks, somehow no one put the words racial harassment into the code that we use for disciplinary
In the
codes.
university.
Well, that's for UW system.
Yeah.
And that would be UWS 17. And putting the words racial harassment into that code will probably necessitate legislative action. On the other hand, it has made us clear that we need to revise our student handbook to make sure that the words racial harassment are in there. Because harassment is not free speech, it is not protected speech, especially criminal harassment. And this looked like it had a threat in it. But because UWS 17 doesn't have anything in there for racially coded threats, the committee, my understanding is the committee could not find that because that was the only charge that the Dean of Students office brought.
Right.
Now, there were other charges. They could have gone to the Wisconsin Intercollegiate Athletic Association, and they didn't because, again, they hit educational institution. They thought that this would be more fitting. They didn't want to punish them. They wanted to educate them. On the other hand, sometimes that backfires, and I think we just saw it backfire.
Yeah.
So we have a number of students are very uncomfortable on campus. They do still have some options. They can turn to, there's some, I'm not going to say them all, but let's just say they have some options, and I'm sure they're exploring them. But for Black faculty on campus, this is a real dilemma. Because now we know these students can engage in this behavior. They're in our classes. And we have to give them a quality education. We cannot treat them differently. But on the other hand, it's in the back of your head, what's this kid gonna do?
Well, and these Snapchats portrayed a burning cross and the KKK.
And threatened to burn the students who were in the BME like wood.
The Black Male Empowerment Group.
Yeah, and if, you know, I mean, those of us who grew up in the North and are white, I don't think understand the intense fear that that brings to a person of color, because that burning cross means death is coming to your door.
And see, I grew up in an area where lynching was common into the 1950s. Pearl River, the Mac Parker case. If you Google that, that was one of the big lynchings in the area where I was. 17 Italians were lynched in New Orleans. 19 Black people were lynched in 1878. So there is a great fear of lynching. I mean, you add to that the New Orleans massacre in 1866, where over 400 Black people were killed just for trying to register to vote. And in my lifetime, the Jackson State kids who were killed for marching to vote. And at Southern University, my parents are alumni. I grew up on this. My mother is Southern University at New Orleans professor until she retired. So I grew up on these campuses, and 3 students were killed there during the protests. So for us, that burning flag really is, that burning cross is a threat. Threatening to burn humans, to burn Black people is a threat. And last week, a Black man's body was found, I think it's either North Carolina or Tennessee, who had been strangled. And it turned out that 4 whites who had pretended to be his friends were the ones who killed him. So the whole incident really touches on one of the biggest issues for Black people in hyper-white spaces, and it is, are these people pretending to be your friend, or are they bullying you? If you turn your back, are they going to kill you? Are they going to hurt you? And will there be consequences if they do that? You know, and it's a part of this history of terrorization and having the authorities not take that terrorization seriously. So it's been very difficult. Now, the chancellor has been wrongfully blamed for this. The chancellor is not the one who made the decision. And because UW's system is involved, my understanding is the chancellor cannot reverse this decision, because this has been decided on appeal. It is outside the university. He no longer gets to intervene.
Well, I think just to interrupt quickly, I think the big thing is, you know, Jody alluded to the fear that that kind of imagery and those thoughts would drive someone to immediate connection to it's a threat to me. There's danger for me. And then you've just basically verified that fear with all the things you were just talking about. And
Everybody black I know in Eau Claire is talking about getting guns.
yeah.
Everybody. We are making plans November 3rd. Whose house are we going to be at? Who's sitting up with the shotguns? And I mean, and I don't think people understand, for someone who is a Southern black, what this history means. This history isn't as far away as they think.
This wasn't 150 years ago. This was in your lifetime, in your parents' lifetime. This
Right.
is stories that you grew up with,
Well,
fear
and
that you
and
grew
it's
up
now.
with, and
I mean, frankly, it's now.
right,
It's less than 50 years.
right.
And Salika, too, the story that you just brought up was of Michael Williams. It wasn't in Tennessee or Carolina. It was in Iowa. It was in rural Iowa.
That's right.
His body was set on fire in a ditch. This is happening miles from our front doors. Like
Right.
this is, and it's not a Southern issue. It's happening right here in the Midwest.
Yep.
It takes a lot of trust to be a black person who stays up here. I mean, at the university, we've talked about this as we've hired new administrators, and there have been people who've been reluctant to hire black administrators because they've been afraid that they would leave. We had one administrator who was very vocal about how scary this place was to her, and that has made an impression. I mean, I've been here 28 years. I know a lot of people. I know who I can trust. But for people who haven't been here maybe as long and who aren't always as tolerant of microaggressions, this can be a fairly scary place. And I also have to say, in order to make this place safe for myself, my husband and I we very rarely go to bars. We're not running around Water Street at night. When I was EDI fellow, the chancellor then, Brian Levin Stankovic, wanted everybody on the leadership team, and that included me, to go walk down Water Street and visit the Water Street bars to see what the students were doing.
They were drinking.
And yeah, well, I knew that. I was like, I don't need to go see this. And we had a really hard discussion about why, no, I was not going to go
Yeah.
into a place where, to be honest, there were people drinking who might call me the N-word because they were drunk.
Yep.
And,
And then Ben would have to start kicking rear.
well, you know, if you pick your battles and you don't kick rear, then they think it's okay, or they think you're a wuss.
Right.
If you do swing on them, you go to jail,
Right.
and now you have no job.
Yep.
So it's really a no-win situation.
Yep.
So in order to live a certain way up here, I do have to be careful about what I do. And that does mean that things have a political impact on me. My husband and I wear masks. And there have been a lot of reports of people who wear masks getting harassed at the post office, at Target, and various other places. So we're pretty much braced when we go to those places that we have to, in case someone who objects to people wearing masks wants to get in our face with racial slurs. And that's not something white people have to think about. And
Yep.
will the police officer who comes for that, will they have stereotypes in their mind? Will they blame us?
How would they tell the difference between you and a criminal black? To quote the miscreant.
Yes.
There are certain spaces that when I go in them, I'm not wearing my engagement ring because the thing is giant. And because I grew up in New Orleans and people would jack you for your jewelry. So I don't usually wear jewelry. But there are certain spaces that I go in, I wear the engagement ring, I wear the jewelry, and I dress very conservatively because that's a warning. You know?
Yep.
And you have to be kind of stupid that if somebody's dressed middle class, to treat them in certain ways. So I'm giving the middle class signatories off. But you still, sometimes, even when I'm dressed that way, I have had people tell me we don't take WIC cards here, women, infants, and children. You know, first off, I've got gray in my hair. What makes you think I'm on WIC? But the other is, if I'm dressed this way and I look this way, why would you say that to me? Why are you assuming?
Yep. You already know the answer.
I had a professor who was at the university ask me if my then infant and I could be in this person's study code switching. And I said, I don't code switch. This is what Louisiana black people sound like. We sound like we're from the Bronx.
Well, if I could, Salika, just real quick, I want to, and I don't want to pile on the traumatic events, but I want to ask Jody. We also had the news of the police officers in Louisville not being indicted for Breonna Taylor's killing. And obviously there's been a lot of unrest in Louisville since then. Take off the representative hat, take off the Democrat hat, just as a human being, what is your response to that event?
I was disappointed, not knowing, and I haven't dug real deep into that case, so I don't know what evidence they could have presented, exactly what the laws are. I find it ironic, two things. One, that what the person was indicted for was actually not shooting the person, but shooting the wall and going into somebody else's apartment. That as Kentucky law stands by this indictment, that wall and that other apartment was more valuable under the law than Breonna Taylor. That's disappointing to me. The other side, we often hear people say, you know, I'm gonna defend my house. Somebody bursts into my house and I'm gonna shoot them, which in some ways is what happened. You know, the police burst in, it was a no-knock warrant. There's debate whether they identified themselves or not, and so I'm not gonna get into that, but let's assume that they didn't, or let's assume that they did, but at the same time, there's a lot of chaos going on. You're sleeping, somebody's in your room all of a sudden, you know, you just woke up, you reach for the gun and you shoot. Well, if it wouldn't have been the police, that person would have been a hero. Instead, the police shoot back and kill somebody and then aren't even held, you know, criminally liable. They were held civilly liable, you know, to the tune of $12 million for the city of Louisville. That says that there is something that was done wrong. And again, I haven't followed it in great detail. I don't know whether the city of Louisville has already said, you know, we're gonna change these policies, we're gonna do this training, whatever. I know a lot of places around the country are talking about banning no-knock warrants. You know, and I'm anxious to have that conversation with people. I know that there are some people that say, this is the reason we need to do it. But knock and enter, not knock, wait 5 minutes and enter. You know, there's a difference with that versus just bursting in. And especially in places where we have, you know, castle doctrine and things like that. You know, your house is your castle. You can defend it at any time. I think that puts police in danger as well, and we need to look at that. If Breonna Taylor's boyfriend would have hit when he fired, we'd be talking about a dead police officer as well as a dead black woman. And so
him going to jail.
And it's dangerous for the police to do that too. So I think we need to make sure, you know, both sides are addressed with that. We need to make it safe for the people who are in that place and also safe for the people who are going into that place.
It's actually more dangerous here because in an urban area, you're going to see more handguns and they have less power. The boyfriend was shooting 9mm, the police were shooting 40s. Up here, people hunt. So you're going to see a 30-30 shotgun. You're going to see a 30-06. You're going to see a 20. You know, a 20 shotgun by itself is going to put a hole through a door.
I was going to say, for those of us who don't know any of that, those are really powerful guns.
They're big calibers that are meant to go more than 50 yards. A 9mm is meant to be effective between 15 and 20 yards. A 30-06 is supposed to shoot something that is maximum distance 100 yards away, but not really going to be accurate at 100 yards. But it's meant to shoot something that is a long way from you. And these are shotguns. I'm not even talking about an AR-15 or anything. An AR-15 compared to a shotgun is a pop gun, because that's a 9mm bullet. You know, I would rather be shot by the AR-15. I would have more of a chance of being alive.
I'm just going to skip.
I was going to think, but we're going to say that we don't want you shot by anything.
Thank
so.
you. I would prefer that. But if you come through a door and somebody has a shotgun, you're dead. So we are risking police lives and these other lives with these no-knock raids for the main reason of preserving evidence. That's the major reason for having a no-knock raid. Every time I have asked an officer, I'm not talking about the patrol officers, I'm talking about a sheriff or a chief, why do we have no-knock raids? It's to preserve evidence. Y'all have poll cameras. Y'all have infrared cameras, you use them. They use them when they're going for weed enforcement.
And there's a certain amount of evidence that they needed to get that warrant anyways, and extra evidence that they needed to get the no-knock warrant.
Yeah.
So there's already evidence that's there as well.
So you don't, and they have, the reason why they have those Bearcats, all right, I call them armored personnel carriers because in real life, that's what they are. They're armored personnel carriers that have things on them to modify them for police use. The reason why you have them is to be able to go into that kind of situation and protect police lives. You can't use a Bearcat with a no-knock raid, because if you're bringing a Bearcat up a street, people are gonna notice. I mean, I'm sorry, this is stupid.
This is your military historian stuff coming in, and we're drifting a little bit far in the weeds on this, so I need to draw us back just a little bit.
I'm just saying the Breonna Taylor situation, I wish I could say it was unique.
Right.
The thing that's upsetting a lot of black people is that the detective who did the no-knock warrant lied about one of the pieces of evidence. Said that there were suspicious packages going to her room. The postal inspectors have publicly said, no, that didn't happen. There's no evidence she was dealing drugs. There's no evidence her boyfriend was dealing drugs. Yet people are slurring her name, claiming she deserved it because she was dealing drugs, you know, and because she had an ex-boyfriend who was dealing drugs.
Well, and even if she was dealing drugs, even if she was guilty of everything that she's accused of, let's just go all the way there. We still have due process in this country. We do not execute on sight.
No, we don't.
And so that's some of the things that need to come up and have a discussion that, you know, whether it's Jacob Blake or George Floyd or whoever, our country stands on the principle of due process. You have a trial by jury, a trial by judge. You have a right to defense. We don't, in Wisconsin, we don't execute. We don't have capital punishment. And if we did, it certainly wouldn't be carried out by the police without due process. Right. And that's, I think, a big piece that needs to be talked about as well with these discussions.
In this country, we have the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment in order to protect us from the things that the British were doing to us. The 5th Amendment is to prevent what's called a star chamber, where people were tortured into confessions. The 6th Amendment is that they're supposed to have a warrant, knock and announce, because you are supposed to be able to be secure in your house and home. And that's what Castle Doctrine's based on. The no-knock warrant unto itself really feels like a violation of the 6th Amendment, because either I have a right to defend my home or I don't. But if you see the way that they're enforced in Texas, you will have a white who has shot somebody, a police officer coming in their house on a no-knock warrant. He's let off. Black man who does the same thing is convicted. And there's actually a case going to the Supreme Court from Texas, 100 miles apart, where 2 men, different races, same exact case, they get 2 different sentences. So you know, who gets a right to self-defense? Who gets a right to the 6th Amendment here? I'll be honest. I am someone who believes that, yeah, if you come break in my house in the middle of the night, you should be prepared for things to happen to you. I grew up in the country, and Slidell and Bogalusa are two places where black people shot back at the Klan. We're kind of notorious for that. Louisiana is the only state that integrated without the use of the Army. But what do I have to pay?
So we have, and this makes sense with having who we have on our panel right now. We went right into talking about policy and history and how these things, how we should respond in a next move strategic kind of way. Let's think about the legal aspects of this. For me, I'm stuck way back in the emotional aspect of it. I'm stuck back in, I have brothers on the UW Eau Claire football team, brothers and sisters in that community that are intimidated, feeling intimidated and fearful. I've got a sister who was killed needlessly in Louisville, Kentucky, who knows how she would have changed the world had she been allowed to live. And so I think it's time we need to start sliding a little bit into the political divide when it comes to thoughts about racial justice. And I want to share a little bit of information from Pew Research, actually. It's an article from September 10th of this year. So this is amongst all registered voters. 44% believe that it's a lot more difficult to be black in the U.S. than it is to be white. And that's up 9% in the last 4 years. 32% say it's a little bit more difficult, and 23% say it is no more difficult. Now, where this gets interesting is that you'll see that 9% change is all amongst Democratic voters. So that bump up from, in terms of thinking about how much more difficult it is to be black in America versus being white in America, that growth in understanding or empathy, or however you want to describe that, has all happened amongst the Democratic base. Biden voters in particular say that 74% of them say that it's a lot more difficult to be, or potential Biden voters, we should say, 74% say it's a lot more difficult to be a black person than a white person. And again, no change amongst Trump voters. And so when I think about that, I'm trying to understand that. I'm trying to understand why there has been a shift in one party and not in the other. And I'm going to just throw out this right now. I'm not going to say it's because I necessarily believe that Democrats are fundamentally more moral or loving than Republicans. I'm not going to say that yet. Maybe we'll get to that. Maybe that'll be the conclusion of all this, but I'm not saying that. I'm not 100% sure that's the answer for this. So I'd love to hear what you all think about that data.
I have a sociological answer and a historical answer. And the historical answer is segregation. If you look at the spaces where people are, the whites who are most likely to interact with people of color tend to be in urban areas. And urban areas tend to skew Democratic. So these are the people who are actually going to have relationships. And within that, if you're looking at the people who are adopting across race, the people who are getting interracially married, and those two things by themselves really drive a lot of the, because it's like, once you have a black child or once you're in an interracial relationship, you will experience more racism yourself. We act like whiteness is this thing that is immobile, but people will remove your whiteness if they think you're an ally or they think you're a family member, or if they think you're a light-skinned black who's passing. So segregation means that the people who are anxious about race get more anxious about race because they don't know anybody of that race. Whereas the people who have more and more experience are going to see more discrimination, especially more covert discrimination. The irony is, my white colleagues who are in integrated areas or who are here have always been more pessimistic about race relations and who's covertly racist than I have, because I won't see it. They're the ones who are in the all-white spaces and hearing people talk. On the other hand, in a rural area like here, you're going to have less experience. Less experience means more anxiety. You see more racial anxiety in places about people who it's easier to stereotype. You don't know anybody black, it's easier to stereotype. You don't know anybody Democratic, it's easier to stereotype. You don't know anybody Republican, it's easier to stereotype. Right. So we're seeing all of that here. And while there's a lot of interracial dating here, it tends to happen only in one class. And those people move towards seeing more racism. But for the other group, they're not interracial dating. They're not going to see it. So it's, you know, segregation and the ways we stereotype each other, I can totally see that being why the bump has happened.
Sure.
And I think too, during COVID, and as more of us are more secluded from just general crowds and general people, you know, we spend more time with our family or our very close friends, or you're on social media a lot more, and social media is almost designed to reinforce the ideas you already have too.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's you've liked certain, you know, media outlets or things like that that are going to reinforce your ideas. And so, you know.
Stop yelling at me, Jody.
Talking to, you know, you're gonna, so is what's going on in Kenosha, is that domestic terrorism, as one of my colleagues called it last week? Or is it people bringing up their right to protest and right to assemble? All depends on which pictures you're looking at.
Yeah.
If you're
Is there a mix somehow of people who are genuinely protesting and then some other element that's coming in to do something else?
Right.
You know?
And that is where it lies too. But, you know, if you're only seeing the burned out car lot, then it's domestic terrorism. Then it's, you know, all of Kenosha, the whole southeast corner of our state has burned down in somebody's minds, because that's what they're seeing on their news feed.
Right.
If you are, you know, friends with some of the people who are protesting and you're seeing, you know, live protests and no violence because it's happening at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you know, you're reinforcing your ideas. And so I think I understand why these numbers would be how they are, and also why things seem to be getting worse and worse in the last couple of months as well, because I think, you know, we do get in these loops where we stay on too much social media, we're looking at too much cable news, we're not getting out of our houses enough because it's not safe sometimes to get out of our houses. And so you're just reinforcing the theories you already have, instead of being able to have good conversations like this where we can get other viewpoints.
Exchange some ideas, yeah.
I'm going to throw one more thing in. The Republicans I know who have changed their views on race have all been in the Army or the Marines.
Interesting.
And they have especially done time at Fort Polk, Louisiana, Norfolk, Virginia, or Base St. Louis. Because, I'll be honest, nobody wants to go to Fort Polk. Vernon, Louisiana is a cesspool. All right, I shouldn't call it a cesspool.
Yeah, see,
I should call it an armpit.
Yeah, we got to help you out with like how you frame up some of these things.
Oh, come on. I'm from Louisiana, and we call that drive-by country. The people are straight up racist. I know military captains, majors, and colonels who have talked about whites in that area pinging bullets off of military vehicles because they're integrated.
Wow.
There are still black people there who, the segregation is informal, and who still don't look a white person in the eye. I have had military spouses saying, oh, I'll never go back again. I know people who have left the Army rather than take an engagement at Fort Polk, and they're white. because the racism is so bad, and it is also aimed at the whites and the white officers who are trying to take care of their multiracial troops. So for Republicans to be in that environment, that is eye-opening. The same in Bay St. Louis, because, okay, I mean,
What are you
I
going to call
give
St. Louis now?
Bay St. Louis.
I know, but what are you going to call it?
It's not an armpit.
It's a drive-by place as well.
Now, East St. Louis, we can name that many
That's a
things.
different place. Bay St. Louis is 20 miles from where I grew up in Slidell.
Gotcha.
And it has a giant naval base there. It has a giant Army ammo plant there. That's where they train a lot of the Navy flyers. And there's a lot of racist people there. I mean, a lot of black people have gone missing in that area. And I have had naval officers say, I'm never going back. And it's the exact same thing. You have white officers who are going, these are the most racist people I've ever seen in my life. What the hell? I didn't know people acted like this. And I think for them, that's a revelation.
Well, I know that we've thought as we've traveled around the country, and my sister-in-law used to live in Oxford, Mississippi, and so we would travel down there. She's now in Austin, Texas. We've traveled in that area, and we love car trips. So, we don't just fly to Mississippi to visit her. We would take a meandering trip down there and go off on this, oh, here's a barbecue joint, we'll find this place, whatever. And it never really hit me. I mean, I know there's racism up here, but it's different racism. It's Norwegian white racism, where we're just going to say it behind your back or something like that. We don't say it in front of your face because we don't do that. We're Norwegian up here. But you go down to Mississippi, and we get out of the car to fill up with gas, and we're naive, and it's like, why isn't the pump turning on? And it's in the middle of nowhere. And they're like, y'all got to pay for that first, especially you white folks. And it was like, this is just a different atmosphere. And so, it's overt racism down here. We have racism up here. It's just quieter.
And one might argue that the racism we have up here might be more dangerous in the long term.
Right.
I would say it's more insidious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because at least, if you're dealing with an open racist, they're racist.
Right.
Okay, so they're discriminating against me because they're racist. It's nothing I've done. It's not my fault.
Right.
Covert racists are insidious, and you sit there going, is this my fault?
Right.
Did I do something? Was there something different I could have
Is
done?
it me? Is it my skin? Is it?
Are they having a bad hair day? Should I give them a second chance? And there's always somebody there saying give them a second chance. This is where white allies are important. Because there have been a couple of times where I said, okay, I don't know what this person's problem is. Maybe I'll give them a second chance. And my white allies are going, nope.
That's it.
Well, and to go back to the football team, okay, so as of system rules, those people who were guilty of the Snapchat can't be kicked off of the team because of system rules.
Right.
I would love to see everybody else who's on that team step back and say, you know what, we're not going to have a team this year then if that's the case. That's where we need to have people stand up and say, what's happening in my community is more important than my workout, than my game, than my practice, whatever. This is going to last forever. That football season's done soon. And that would be truly incredible if we could see that football team do that.
Well,
we've seen walkouts on campus, and that's been very powerful. What if the whole football team walked out?
They have the option to quit.
That's what I mean.
And I think they know that. All right, I know they know that. And that's an option. I get the hardest thing here, and it goes past this partisan divide, is will white allies stand up? Will they stand up for me? Will they stand up for these players? And I've been in a little bit of a dark place for the last couple of days, looking at my husband, and he's been understanding it, going, well, I don't know who's going to stand up for us if something happens, and we've had to think about that. And I think that the hardest part of looking at this partisan divide, I'm Louisiana, we don't pronounce it right. I always say Partisan. I'm trying to think before I say it. Just
It's
like
the
I have
French talk.
It's the French thing. I mean, yeah. But, you know, I don't want to look at my Republican neighbors with suspicion. And I'm fighting very hard not to do that. But it's there. It's there. And I don't want to stereotype them because I feel if I'm asking whites not to stereotype me, I can't stereotype them.
Right.
But on the other hand, can I trust them? And I think that's the problem with all this. I worked for Brent Scowcroft. I've worked for Republicans when I was at Rand. I worked for Democrats. And I saw Democrats and Republicans working in a bipartisan manner on the Gays in the Military project, on several projects. And what they always said to me was, we are not Republican, we are not Democrat, we are Americans, and we put the national interest first. And that means we will work together. So it really hurts me to read, all right, I am going to use the word cesspool. The cesspool that is the Facebook comments at WEAU. That's not WEAU's fault. They said, I've had several reporters say, we can't go in there either. It's awful.
But as an
moderate.
organization, they can stand up and say, here are our.
They can set guidelines, they can
Yep.
set rules,
And they should.
can
But
moderate. It is
Salika's
possible.
being nice and trying to let them off the hook a little bit here. So.
Yeah, it's possible to moderate.
I kind of
comments.
wish they would just yank the Facebook comments. They could just turn off the comments. Just put it on Facebook, turn off the comments. But
But I
All right,
think
so
that
that's another
real
show.
quick, just real quick, hold that thought for just a second, because our time is slipping away. All right?
Sorry.
No, you're okay. You're okay. So I want to take a moment, if you just joined us here in the last little bit, and reintroduce our panelists. We've got Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton, our resident panelist, my partner in crime, military historian. I don't know, she knows like at least a little bit about everything. And then Representative Jody Emerson from the 91st District here in Wisconsin, joining us as well. And then we've got Adam Akala manning the chat function over there. Adam, are we seeing any engagement from our community here?
Yeah, I've got a really awesome question here from David. I do want to tee it up, though, with a specifically partisan question. There are some things that our president has said that I literally cannot say on this show. He has recently told a rally of his supporters that they were genetically superior. These things are often being excused by the right as jokes or misunderstandings, but it's trickling down and becoming a fundamental piece of their platform and a piece that this president is pandering to for votes. So where does this line get drawn so that people start actually denouncing the things that are racially insensitive or overtly racist so that they don't become a part of this party's platform? Because I know there are some decent Republicans out there and some that can see the covert and overt racism that happens. So when does it matter to them enough to denounce their party and say that it's wrong and stand up for marginalized citizens? Where is that line? And I really do wish that Representative James was here to answer that question for me, because it's very much something that we need to be asking our Republican colleagues, our friends, our family.
Yes.
Where is that line?
Well, a lot of people that I know who have been lifelong Republicans are saying, I haven't left the Republican Party has left me, and we're seeing things get more and more separated politically. I'm gonna go into a mini lecture here, and I'm gonna blame this on power and gerrymandering. Because if we look at Wisconsin, and we are one of the worst politically gerrymandered states in the country. There was a Harvard study that on a scale of 1 to 100, 1 being as gerrymandered as it possibly can be, 100 being perfectly, fair. We are a 3. not third, but 3. And so what that comes with then is when you're looking at, and I'll look at it from the assembly point of view, we're elected every 2 years. There's 99 of us in the state. We represent roughly 65,000 people apiece. When you have districts that are drawn very Democratic, because the Republicans drew the maps, and the party in power always does this, and the Democrats have done it too. I will cop to that. However, when the maps were drawn recently in 2011, we had our computerized mapping software was advanced enough to be able to do it as perfectly as you wanted. Where before you'd look at the old-fashioned map and go, oh yeah, there's a river here and a county line here, and let's draw it like this. And oh, I know Eau Claire's a little bit more Democratic, so we'll put that one over here with this stuff. And there was some partisan stuff done. But now with the computer software that we have, we can do ward counts, which ward goes to which presidential candidate, and really get it down there. And that's exactly what happened in 2011. So when you've got a Democratic district and a Republican district, you know, and there's some that are drawn that way. The 91st is drawn as a Democratic district. As it's been drawn, we've never had a Republican hold this district. And so what happens is when you have a primary, you get the most extreme one way or the other. You'll either get the most liberal coming out of a Democratic district, or you'll get the most conservative coming out of a Republican district. Okay, so then that comes out and you take them all and you put them down in Madison. So again, on that scale of 0 to 100, 0 being very conservative, 100 being very liberal, instead of being more fair maps and you're getting 45s and 65s, more about the middle, those people can work together a little bit more. Now you're getting 20s and 80s coming out of those primary races and going down to Madison. And you're so divided on just ideological basis that you can't work together. And so a lot of the divide that we're seeing in Madison comes down to gerrymandering.
Yes.
And it comes down to it's more important for certain people to be in power than it is to do the right thing. And I'll talk about Black History Month. I've been in the legislature for 1 session. My first session, so it was about a month into it, we came up behind Black History Month. And traditionally the Black Caucus, and it used to be the Black and Latino Caucus, but we've gotten enough minorities now. We have a Black Caucus and we've got a Latino Caucus. They would say, here's our list of people who we want to honor. Well, in 2019, Colin Kaepernick was on that list. And the Republicans would not bring it up for a vote as is. Because how it works in the legislature is the party in power approves what is going to be voted on that day. They wouldn't bring up that as is because Colin Kaepernick was on there, and that was so offensive to them that somebody would take a knee in protest of police brutality and racial injustice, that they couldn't even honor him in this way.
Yeah.
And so we had to do an amendment and get Colin Kaepernick off of there in order to even address Black History Month. Fast forward to 2020, this year earlier, we had the Black Caucus didn't come up with Black History Month proclamation. Representative Scott Allen came up with it. For those of you who don't know, Scott Allen is white. And so he came up with it, and I believe everybody he wanted to honor in Black History Month was white. There may have been a couple ones in there, a couple Black people in there, but it was people from the Underground Railroad, and there were some reasons to honor those people. But let's honor them not in Black History Month.
Can I ask a question? What the actual hell? Seriously.
So,
I mean, come on.
And it's 1 month. If we can't give our Black colleagues an opportunity to say, here's who you want to honor during your month, it was So if you take those two, I think that shows you how racial issues are handled in the state assembly.
It was
Right.
a yanking of chains.
Yeah.
It really was. And instead of having people work together the American tradition, and I'm saying this as a historian, has been consensus through conflict. We work together and we get better legislation through compromise. Instead of getting compromise, we have ideologues now, and they think compromise is impossible because it's a sin. How do you compromise with sin? So to them, Colin Kaepernick kneeling to the flag is a sin. And I look at them and I go, all right, who died? Where is this in the Bible? And they can't tell me, they'll just name call. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of the logical fallacy cards I'll throw on it. And there, and it doesn't really, it goes not just across the partisan divide, it goes across the class divide as well. Just as you have some people who can't compromise coming from the really far left, and they will shoot at moderates from the way, like the anarchist who was coming after me, because to compromise with the police, or to say these police are doing a good job and these are not, to them is a sin. So you can't compromise with sin. And the problem is they have made things into sin, or made things into the secular version of sin that were never meant to be sins. COVID is not a sin. COVID should not be approached as if you do these things, you are committing a sin. You are committing either a sin against democracy or you're committing a sin against science. That once you get into this ideological name calling, you can't see a compromise.
Yeah.
And we were there in 1968. In 1968, the US had a choice. We could choose white supremacy, or we could choose democracy, fight communism. And we chose racial integration, to be honest, to fight communism, to take something away from the communists that they were using to divide us. Today, and realize the white supremacists then also claimed Martin Luther King was a communist. They called him Martin Luther Coon. They claimed the entire civil rights movement was communist. Black people had to be very careful. That's why you see all the flags in the old pictures. People are wearing the flag pins. The ministers are wearing the good blue suits. They say, no, we're not communists. We are your neighbor.
Well, we're fascists and socialists now, so.
But see, it's the same thing. Yep. But for the people who really are patriotic, they're looking at this and going, no. You've given our enemies something. This supremacy, this police brutality is giving our enemies something to divide us with. And our choice is, do we end police brutality so we are not divided? Or do we see police brutality as something that is necessary for segregation? Because realize, police brutality is really defending segregation. And are we willing to risk our democracy to maintain segregation? That's the question we have. It's the question we answered in '68 by saying no.
Well, and I think some of the debate ends up being, are we debating police brutality or are we debating police? And it depends on which party you're at, how that question is answered. I've had Republicans say, and there was one who was on WPR 2 weeks ago saying, I will 100% back the badge all the time. I will always. And what I need police officers to do, and I've seen it clearly coming from the Eau Claire police, and I'm so proud to say that I represent the city of Eau Claire, where we can have a good police department and a good police chief who's saying, you know what Derek Chauvin did in Minneapolis is wrong. And so we're not debating whether police did something wrong. We're debating whether a bad police officer did something wrong. And it's not a fine line, it's a big line between police and police brutality. And to understand that these marches aren't protesting police, They're protesting police brutality.
Well, I mean, I have been threatening. I've got the Black Lives Matter sign in front of my house. It's going to be next to the Wu-Tang sign, by the way. And I'm ordering an insane clown posse, because if insane clown posse was in the presidency, we would not have problems. ICP forever.
Adam's falling off his chair laughing back there.
But
I think we may have just lost all credibility that we built in the last
Hold
couple
on
of
a
months.
minute. I have been threatening to put a Back the Blue sign right next to my Black Lives Matter sign.
Yeah, they're not
Because
separate.
I can be anti-police brutality without being anti-police.
Yep.
Our argument should be, what are we going to hold police accountable for, and what discretion are we going to allow police?
Yep.
Instead, we have people who, you know, have hit every card on the Your Logical Fallacy deck. And if you have not gone to yourlogicalfallacy.com, you need to go there. Because they don't want to have that discussion. They want to name call, they want to scream, and they see this as a win-lose instead of, we need to come together and find a way to make this.
So you're alluding to something that gets right at the heart of my concern with the data we looked at earlier. I'm going to make this statement real quick, and then I know we probably have some more questions. I am concerned that we have folks both on the right and the left, people who are traditionally Republicans, traditionally Democrats, who will just toe the party line. So if the Democratic establishment or the Republican establishment comes out and says, this is what we believe in, this is what we stand for, this is our platform, there are people who basically function as acolytes of that establishment who will then go with whatever. And that to me is incredibly dangerous. And it only exacerbates the polarity we're talking about now. So that was a heavy loaded statement. And with that, I'm going to ask Adam for another question.
Sure thing. And this is a pretty heavy question as well. A couple parts. So if you need me to repeat any of it, just let me know. This is from David. So if an amendment to the Constitution were ratified that reinstituted the voting rights for all felony disenfranchised citizens, what would be the impact on the United States political landscape? For example, now political candidates would have to go into prisons and jails and speak with their incarcerated constituents in an effort to secure their votes. Could this potentially be a fatal blow to the system of mass incarceration that disproportionately affects people of color in this country existent within the United States?
I'm so glad that this question has been answered because it's something that I've been tackling. I was one of the authors of the Unlock the Vote legislation that we had. And so for those of you who don't know, Unlock the Vote would allow for people who are on probation and parole to be able to vote in an election. In Wisconsin, you can't until your sentence is completely done, which those of us who don't know a whole lot about the mass incarceration think, oh, well, you're out, you get maybe 6 months of probation and parole or whatever, and then, no, it can be years. I've got a friend of mine who won't be off probation and parole until 2032, and he's been out for several years already. It's people like this who are paying taxes and can't vote for the school board members for the school that their kid goes to. They can't vote for the judges. That bothers me.
So they're like real people.
Real people.
Okay, so like when we're
Like
talking
actually being in their communities and being.
Right,
And you probably know them.
So you don't automatically become less than human when you're incarcerated.
No, you're still a real
Oh,
person.
okay.
But see, to some people, if you've been incarcerated, you no longer have any right.
Yes.
Yep.
And if you've ever been incarcerated, if somebody kills you after that, or anything, it's your own fault.
Right.
And see, that's the problem. I mean, there's two parts here. One part is what you're getting at, Jody, but the other part is we need to take a good look at these laws that we're incarcerating people over.
Yes.
Because we have made petty craziness felonies. I mean, for a while, and now thank God they fixed it, you could get on the sex offender list for public urination. They only fixed that about 5 years ago. But you look at things like giving someone a cigarette or selling someone a loose cigarette. That's still a ticketable offense. Police just have decided not to enforce it because it's stupid. You know, the whole taillight thingy.
Yes. In our package of bills, we also had a prison gerrymandering bill. So where you are living is where you count for how that district is drawn. And there was, it was actually, I think on the podcast Code Switch, that they talked about this, and they called it Prison City, Wisconsin, Waupun. And there is actually a city council district that takes up the Waupun prison. And then I think it's like 74 people outside of the prison that is this person's constituency. So even though none of the people in the prison can vote for him or her, that is most of the city council district. And so, you know, we've got districts where they will have 7 prisons in their assembly district. So, you know, we were trying to deal with prison gerrymandering. We were trying to make sure that people could vote as soon as they were out of prison. And a piece I wanted to include and had the bill all written was to allow people in prison to vote as well. And I had people on the left and the right coming at me on this one and saying, well, this is going to change how election outcomes if we let people in prison vote.
Yes, it will.
Well, and if it's changing election outcomes, we've got too many people in prison.
Yes.
You know, I mean, that's first and foremost. And I wasn't looking at the presidential elections or even the assembly. I was looking at district attorney and judges and sheriffs. And let's be honest, who knows how those people act in their jobs better than people who have been through the court?
Yep.
Well, in 1972, cocaine was a ticketable offense. You would get 30 days in jail, and then you were out, and you'd usually do work release. Then you had the first war on drugs, and that's Nixon.
Yep.
But even then, it was still a year, and you would get 6 months probation.
Then just say no came.
Then just say no. You saw Reagan, and then you saw the Clinton prison reform bill. So I want to make sure people understand this is bipartisan craziness.
There's a lot of bipartisan craziness.
That people don't always understand. I saw that sausage made in D.C., sometimes right in the front lobby.
Yeah.
And it was scary. And, you know, we have to talk about why are we sending people away for years for weed?
Yep.
We have to talk about treatment rather than incarceration for nonviolent drug offenses for small amounts. When you're sending people away for 30 years for a dime bag of crack, you are wasting people. I mean, we have a
And
labor
resources.
shortage right now.
Yep.
Even forget about the humanity aspect of this.
Yep.
The resources that goes into the prosecution, and then the state has to support this person within the prison system.
Yep.
I mean, it's foolishness.
Well, Republicans are divided. You have a set that are libertarian. That's the Koch brothers, Scafee Foundation. I'm trying to think.
Americans for Prosperity. And they
they
actually put on a great conference that I was at this year on criminal justice reform. It was ironic. I'm on the Criminal Justice Committee, and there was a package of bills that came out this year, the Tougher on Crime package. I had to vote in the committee on those bills, hop on an airplane, go to this conference, come back, and then vote on the floor. So, I mean, I had Tougher on Crime sandwiched in between criminal justice reform conference sponsored by Americans for Prosperity and ALEC. You know, some of the most conservative groups that are out there nationwide. And one of the things that was said, and I wrote it down and it stuck with me ever since, is, are you putting people in prison because you're scared or mad at them? So if we're doing it for public safety, if we're thinking that if we let this person out, he or she is going to rape and pillage and burn and kill, yes, that person needs to be put away for a long time. You know, there's a reason why Charles Manson isn't out on the streets. However, if we're putting them away for 40 years because we're angry that they did something that we wouldn't have done, then you have to rethink criminal justice.
Well, it's the Louisiana case with the guy who is in jail for life now for stealing a Snickers. It's either a Snickers bar or it's something like that. It's
Adam will
stupid.
find out.
Adam will look for it. And that came through just about a month ago, and one black judge on the Louisiana Supreme Court said this was a travesty. So sometimes these 3 strikes laws are ridiculous.
Yep.
And there's also this thing we call the Shirley issue. Because when people pass these laws, people will say, but what if? And they go, well, surely there'll be an exception. Well, no, there is no Shirley, S-H-I-R-L-E-Y, and there is no Shirley, S-U-R-E-L-Y.
And as a
no
legislator,
exceptions.
you don't pass a law based on most likely what's going to happen. You look at those exceptions and figure out, how does this work? And during that Tougher on Crime package, there was something about, I can't remember the bill number exactly, but through our discussion, somebody said it was about minors and criminal destruction of property. And should that be made a felony, and should they get waived into adult court and all this kind of stuff. And one of the my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, who has boys, and I think are out of the house now, but she was looking at it through the lens of
Mama boys, yep.
silly teenager boys who just do silly things. And she's like, it could be a, senior prank where they throw lawn furniture into the pool and it could damage the pool, and that pool would need to be replaced. And then how does that react? And we called it the suburb amendment. She put an amendment in that it wouldn't work for certain situations, because all of a sudden they realized that this was going to affect suburban kids too, not just the urban kids.
I want to say just real quick, because the time is just flowing on by here. I'm not sure we ever really answered David's question about how it would impact elections, actual results.
I think it would change the entire election process in part, because we have removed about a quarter of black men and close to a quarter of black women from the election process.
Yes.
And if I talk about poor whites and meth,
Yep.
I mean, you have whole swaths of Kentucky that about a third of whites in Kentucky cannot vote.
Yep.
So if you're looking at certain places, half of the population can't vote. And
Not
that's
just Kentucky, it could be Barron County too, or rural areas in Wisconsin as well.
But what you're saying is this isn't purely a race issue, it's also a class issue. And when you have people of certain classes that are being targeted to be, and then eventually incarcerated at a higher clip than other classes, that's going to have an impact on who gets elected.
Yes.
Because of the way the laws are currently configured.
And I will say that sometimes I think those laws and those bills are put out there to eliminate some people from voting. I'll go that far.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen the ugliness in Madison.
Well,
that they think we're gonna let's.
Well, and here's where we get theological, philosophical again. I always go here, is like, people are just screwed up, and we're always going to look out for ourselves when we're left to our own devices, unless we learn how to love people and actually focus on other people. And so my contention has always been, people in power are going to find ways to stay in power.
Yep.
And solidify their power, consolidate it. So.
They always want to. I mean, that's why it's up to us to put checks on them.
Right.
But I started with the libertarians. So the libertarians over here, they want smaller government. They would like to reform all these laws so that getting in a fist fight at your high school doesn't mean that you're 16 and charged as an adult. But then you have a set of neoconservatives. They want to use government to change behavior.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing right now. And they, right now, are the ones who are pushing all these changes in voting and trying to get this permanent majority, because they want to use government to enforce a culture that, to be honest, the libertarian Republicans don't want, that liberal, moderate Democrats don't want, and that leftists don't want. Now, I mean, when we talk about anybody in power can be stupid, you get some extreme leftists, they want to ban big cups of soda in New York, and then you get black people like me like, no. And they get mad at us, and it's like, well, it's unhealthy, we know what's best.
I need the
No.
large Coke Zero.
Look, I am the spokesperson for Coke Zero. I live on it. You are not going to criminalize a big cup. That's stupid. Because that just becomes a gateway to abuse.
And again, it's trying to legislate behavior.
And again, it is. And these are sort of these neoliberals who would like to use government to legislate behavior. And the problem is neoconservatives and neoliberals. And see, they keep trying to say neoliberal is conservative. They're conservative Democrats. And it drives me nuts because that's not what the Greek and Latin is supposed to be.
Okay, history professor, roll it back.
But I mean, these people want to use government to regulate your behavior.
Right.
And they are using the Republican Party right now. If they thought they could do it with the Democratic Party, they would do it with the Democratic Party. But they're doing this because they're not vested in democracy. They're vested in power. And what we have to decide is, are we vested in democracy or are we vested in comfort?
Yep. Adam, did you have a burgeoning thought or question over there?
Just a clarification on what Salika had brought up. Jacobia Grimes is a 34-year-old New Orleans man who has a 9th grade education and 5 prior theft convictions, who was charged under a felony theft statute with stealing $31 worth of candy bars from a convenience store on December 9th. His record made him subject to a sentence of 20 years to life under the habitual offender law if he's convicted.
Yeah,
I don't
so
quite see what behavior that
How
would change.
stupid are we? I mean, seriously,
Exactly.
how stupid are we? This is
So for
stupid.
$31 of candy
Yeah,
bars, we're
it's-
going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars incarcerating
and we're
this
gonna ruin
man.
this man's life over $31 worth
We're going to
of
send
chocolate
him
bars.
to Angola, to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where he will make 4 cents an hour picking crops, and it will cost the state of Louisiana $80,000 a year to incarcerate him.
So,
it.
so
And-
it's an illogical form of slavery.
Yes. It is a subsidized version of slavery because Del Monte will get some cheap crops out of it, but the state of Louisiana is providing a giant subsidy for the labor.
Y'all getting me angry up in here right now, I'm telling you.
Well, we have to, again, look where the money is going. Prison labor, what pushes mass incarceration is prison labor.
Right.
And again, that's bipartisan, but prison labor is a giant source of subsidized labor to American business. And once we recognize that, we have to start saying, what are we doing here? This is why you can't get a unionized job.
And I think we need to look at incarceration as, let's take out the extreme examples of Charles Manson and Jamie Kloss's kidnapper and, people who we don't want to ever see back out on the streets again. Honestly, most people who are in prison are going to be out on the streets at some point. So are we going to set them up for success when they leave those doors, or are we setting them up for failure? Again, in that criminal justice conference that I was at, there was a formerly incarcerated man who was talking about his time at this prison in the general Oakland area and how he got education while he was there, and he also got a job as a programmer, not in the prison labor sense. He was actually paid like $30 an hour. And so by the time he left prison, he'd paid off all of his restitution, all of his court fines, and actually had money in the bank to get his first apartment and be able to have, security deposit and all these things. And the job that he had at this private company in this prison took him for a job when he got out. So he was like a computer programmer. As soon as he got out of prison, he was earning like 6 figures. He had something to keep his
Surely
nose
there
clean.
are those of us who will listen to this and say, well, Why was he given that opportunity? He was a criminal.
And
Because they needed computer programmers. They couldn't find enough there
Right.
in that area, and that's why they
So
set
it
this
wasn't a
program
matter
up.
of wasn't a matter of it's the right thing to do to empower this person. It was a matter of
It was successful for that business. They needed those people,
Yeah.
And by setting
my
this,
cynicism is
I
coming
know.
out, Jody. I apologize.
I mean, I'm married to a journalist. Come on, cynicism is surrounding me, but
But if all lives matter, incarcerated lives have to matter.
That's right.
absolutely.
That's right.
And we are wasting incarcerated lives because, one, we're putting them in jail for petty stuff that, to be honest, before 1972, they wouldn't have gone to jail for. If you look at who's in jail, in prison, less than 10% of prisoners are in there for violent crime.
Right.
And prison is meant to keep people who are violent away from the community. More than half of them have mental illness.
Yes.
And when we look at the people who have committed violent crimes, there are researchers who have done MRIs of their brains. Usually they have brain damage in the frontal lobes, some abusive step-parent, et cetera. This is why you don't smack kids in the head, no hitting in the head. And they get damage
Right.
in the impulse control areas. And that's something we have to look at. But we've been using prison since the 1980s as a holding ground for people with mental illness, for people with brain damage,
Addiction.
addiction, and it's not working.
All right, so I got to stop you because it's 8:56, for goodness sake.
I'm
And
sorry.
I wrote some notes about the last like 15, 20 minutes of our conversation, and my notes say that we need to do an episode on mass incarceration, apparently.
Yes.
We can
So-
do that.
Can I come back for it?
If the money's right.
Yes, we can bring you back. And I mean, I think that this is one, I've got a couple of people who were formerly incarcerated. She knows who I'm thinking of. And bring them there. I will say, let me disclose this publicly. My brother is formerly incarcerated. My brother spent 25 years in the Louisiana State Penitentiary system. He killed a man in what he perceived as self-defense. The man was doing this, and this is someone who had beaten him with and pistol whipped him before. The guy did this at a park. Butch thought he was pulling a gun, so he shot him. And,
And your brother, because he's a civilian and a black man, gets 25 years in prison.
yes,
If he would have been wearing a badge.
he wouldn't have.
Well, that's a good point.
So,
Adam?
but he is rehabilitated, and he was 3/4 of the way through law school before he went to prison. In prison, he studied industrial electricity, and he is a certified industrial electrician. We need that. We need that, and we need to think about who we're incarcerating and what our laws, how difficult our laws make it today to claim self-defense for domestic violence victims, male or female, for victims who are being stalked and for victims who are being harassed. Because if we can deal with that, we can cut our mass incarceration by probably 90%. And that will bring your taxes down.
Adam, did you have something?
Yeah, I've just been thinking about action steps as we're kind of closing out the show here. And honestly, Ed, when you messaged me earlier today that Representative James couldn't be here, I was very disappointed, much like you were,
Yeah.
that we weren't going to have quite the balance that we would, and have him able to kind of speak to his party and his beliefs and what they're doing. And so I don't think it's unique to this particular situation that we are having Republican elected officials not showing up. They're not showing up to have conversations. They're not showing up to have debates and talk about the issues and actually represent their constituents. They're hiding behind the gerrymandered lines. And so I would personally like to see more Republican engagement to actually talk about these things. I have personally reached out to Warren Petrick, who represents my parents' district, and I've received nothing but form letters. I've reached out to Representative Emerson, and I have received personal messages. And I do come from a place of privilege where I know Jody on a personal level, and I feel comfortable reaching out to her personally, but I feel that that level of care is not given to me by my Republican elected officials. And so I'm not saying that Representative James didn't show up tonight because he didn't want to. He is ill, but it's a common theme that we are seeing in the Republican Party in Wisconsin, that they're not showing up. So that would be an action item for me, would be for my elected officials to show up.
And I would also just tag on to that, you know, even though we're elected officials, life happens and a kid gets sick or you get sick or,
Right.
you know, stuff happens. However, Jesse represents the 68th district, but there's more than just the 68th district around here. He could have called Senator Bernier. Bernier could have showed up. Warren Petrick could have, you know, we know each other's phone numbers. Like, we could have had somebody from the Republican Party. I think that speaks to the fact that maybe they didn't want to have this conversation. I don't know. I mean, I'll give Jesse the benefit of the doubt that he was ill, but who was going to take over in his stead?
Right.
And in election season too, you know, Senator Smith and I, both Democrats, show up at the Chamber of Commerce all the time for their exit issues, for their legislative discussions. I talked about it in May at our last one before we went into election season. I said, I hope I'm seeing my Republican colleagues showing up at some of the, you know, more left-leaning debates. And they weren't at the Citizen Action and Jonah event that we just had recently. And that's disappointing to me, because our voters deserve to hear from both sides and make an informed decision.
Right.
Just like we're gonna see tomorrow night, you know, both of our presidential candidates showing up and debating the issues. You know, we as people who are voting deserve to be educated on it. And if you can't get it from a debate, which I would hope that all elected officials would show up at those, or candidates, you know, you got to dig in and look at websites and find articles and things like that. And it's very important, because an educated electorate helps make our democracy work.
Yep.
And I'm going to add one thing here, which is that, you know, by not being here and not having a substitute, it forces someone like me into a very uncomfortable position, because today I had to play the Republican and talk about what that Republican position is, and try to make sure that I gave it its due, and also talk about how Republicans and Democrats can cross that divide. I'm not a Republican. I mean, I used to do policy debate. I know how to see both sides. But it makes me uncomfortable, because when I have to do this, people get the impression that I am a Republican, and all of a sudden I get hit with some of these issues. And it's like, actually, I'm an independent and I hate you all. I like you.
All of us?
No, I like you. But I mean, you know, it's like that. I'm an independent and I can criticize both, but I can also love on both.
Yes.
And Jody's my friend, so yes, I still love you. Don't worry about it. There will be wine, and Prince. But really, and you know, I know several of the Republicans here, and it's like people show up because y'all getting me mad.
Yeah.
And this means that I'm going to jump in your faces and go, why are you leaving me out here hanging?
And
why are you doing this to me? I'm trying to, you know, be bipartisan. I'm trying to help bridge this. I can't bridge a divide if the other half doesn't show up.
All right, y'all. Listen, we're 4 minutes over right now. 2 minutes over is about, you know, like we get grace for 2 minutes. We've got to stop this. But I want to thank Jody Emerson once again for being here. Thank you, as always, Salika. Thank you, Adam, for being here tonight. We also want to, and I just want to say real quick, a little bit to the point of what Salika just said. I'm not a real fan of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, to be honest with you, but I have friends in each, and people that I respect, people that I love. But I feel like there are problems on both sides of the spectrum when it comes to those things. And part of the problem for me comes to when we're talking about issues like systemic racism and we're talking about issues like police brutality and mass incarceration and all these things, that we automatically seem to gravitate toward whatever the party line is rather than being willing to be honest and take a hard look at what's really happening and actually talk to people who are being impacted by these things. And so for me, laws and policy are super important. The political aspect of it is all important, but at the heart of this, none of this is centrally a political issue. It is a human issue. It is a life and death issue. It runs so much deeper. And you ask the family of Ahmaud Arbery, is this a political issue? You ask the family of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Ask my son if this is a political issue. It's not. Ask families that have been stuck in cycles of generational poverty and trauma. Mm-hmm. Ask families who have been impacted by the war on drugs and the mass incarceration that has entailed, or that has made happen. It's not political. It's about people. And we got to figure this stuff out. We got to look at what's happening inside of us. We got to look at our neighbor, and we got to figure out, how do we love our neighbor well? And when we do that, then what we do politically will be coming from a much better informed place. It'll be coming from a much more of a place of integrity and character than just towing the party line. So once again, I want to thank the Pablo Center for housing us and giving us this great space to do this. Thank you to Uniting Bridges, Converge. Thanks again to our wonderful panelists. Next week, please join us, and I promise we won't go like more than 2 minutes past 9 next week. We're going to talk about Jesus, Christianity, and race. This is something that Salika and I have been itching to talk about since we started this series. And we're going to have Pastor Paul Smith from Westridge Church. We're going to have Christine Warlowski from St. James the Greater, and Pastor Phil Rugi Jones from Grace Lutheran Church. They're going to be joining us for this discussion, and we'd love for you to join us as well. Have a great week, and hopefully we'll see you next week.